The Kharijites were hardline egalitarians. They rejected the nepotistic succession of caliphs that was based on ancestral kinship with the Prophet Muhammad. They selected an Amazigh man named Maysara al-Medgari to be their leader, a man who, according to tradition, had previously been a lowly water carrier. They waited until the local Umayyad general, Habib ibn Abi Ubaidah, sailed northwards to lead an expedition against Byzantine Sicily, and upon his departure, shaved their heads in Kharijite fashion, bound Quranic scriptures to their spears, and marched out for battle. The Great Amazigh Revolt had begun. A new power was rising. By the time of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, his followers had conquered all of Arabia. Nearly immediately afterwards, the Muslims would storm out of their homeland as some of the most efficient conquerors in world history. In 641, the armies of Caliph Umar had conquered Byzantine Egypt and quickly turned their gaze westward to the fertile coasts of the Maghreb. The Muslim conquest of North Africa was a long and grueling process that began in 647 and was only completed a full 62 years later. Throughout it all, the Amazigh put up brutally stubborn resistance. Unlike the Eastern Romans, the native tribesmen were well accustomed to the fast-paced desert warfare of their Arab foes, and were able to match them toe-to-toe. Perhaps the greatest symbol of Berber resistance was the warrior queen Dahia, who crushed an army of the nascent Umayyad Caliphate near the town of Meskiana in 698. Nevertheless, she was defeated at the Battle of Tabaka, and with her death, the lands of the Berbers were quickly conquered, becoming the Umayyad province Ifriqiya, from the word Africa that the Romans used for the same region. Ironically, the tribal warrior lifestyle that made the Amazigh such fierce foes also allowed them to integrate seamlessly into the new Muslim world. Berbers converted to Islam en masse, but for the most part this conversion was nominal at best, and despite professing a new faith, the Amazigh retained many attributes of their languages, social structure, and many traditional practices. It was also during this century that the Trans-Saharan trade network began expanding, linking the Arabic world to sub-Saharan Africa, which subsequently introduced the Muslim faith to many communities in West and Central Africa, such as the powerful Empire of Ghana. Despite all this, the Amazigh were undoubtedly a subject people. While in theory, the Quran holds all Muslims equal under God, the Berbers soon found that in practice, they were still second-class citizens compared to the Arabic elites. For example, during the conquest of Iberia, Berber soldiers had been put in more dangerous theaters of battle, while the Arabs were often kept in reserve. Despite this, the Berbers often received less pay and war loot than their Arab comrades. Heavy taxation was another budding issue. Under the Pact of Umar, Jewish and Christian communities under Muslim rule were guaranteed safety, but in return had to pay a regular tribute, known as the jizya or poll tax. The Amazigh were originally payers of the jizya, but as they converted to Islam, the amount of tax revenue coming from the western half of the caliphate began to dry up. To counteract this, Arab governors of the Umayyad province of Ifriqiya began imposing the poll tax on Muslim Berber converts, in direct violation of Islamic law. One such Arab governor was a man known as Yazid ibn Abi Muslim, who assumed control of the province of Ifriqiya in 720. Historians condemn Yazid as a pointlessly cruel man who treated his non-Arab subjects with contempt, even branding the hands of his Berber guardsmen. This was a step too far, and the Amazigh in Yazid's employ had him assassinated. The seeds of rebellion were further spread among the Berbers, with the introduction of a sect of Islam known as Kharijism to the Maghreb coast. The Kharijites were hardline egalitarians. They rejected the nepotistic succession of caliphs that was based on ancestral kinship with the Prophet Muhammad, believing that any man, regardless of descent or social status, could rule the Muslim world so long as he was uncompromisingly pious and just. They even proclaimed that, should he be holy enough, they would even accept the rule of an Abyssinian slave with a slit nose. However, the most committed belief of the Kharijites was that if a Muslim ruler should fall to corruption and sin, it was not only their right, but their God-given duty to rise up in rebellion. As one can imagine, the passionate message of the Kharijites captured the imagination of many a Berber firebrand, who saw embracing it as a means to spiritually justify a holy war against their Arab oppressors. The ball finally got rolling in 739, when the Gomara, Bagwata and Miknasa tribes of western Morocco rebelled against the Umayyad Caliphate. They selected an Amazigh man named Maysara al-Medgari to be their leader, a man who, according to tradition, had previously been a lowly water carrier. They waited until the local Umayyad general, Habib ibn Abi Ubaidah, sailed northwards to lead an expedition against Byzantine Sicily, and upon his departure, shaved their heads in Kharijite fashion, bound Quranic scriptures to their spears, and marched out for battle. The great Amazigh revolt had begun. Soon it spread across the deserts of the western Maghreb. The city of Tangiers quickly fell to al-Medgari's rebel army, who executed its Umayyad governor, Umar al-Maradi, a detested man whose tribute policies had previously been bleeding the Amazigh dry. The rebels then carved a path of destruction from the Strait of Gibraltar to the Sus Valley, toppling Umayyad garrisons along the way, while more and more Berber tribes joined the cause. However, a column of elite Arab cavalrymen, made up of the aristocratic elites of Ifriqiya, clashed with the rebels in the outskirts of Tangiers, halting their advance and forcing al-Medgari to pull his armies back to Tangiers proper. Condemned for his cowardice, al-Medgari was deposed and executed by the Berber chieftains, and was replaced with Khalid ibn Hamid al-Zinati, the charismatic chieftain of the Zinata tribe. Khalid was declared the Caliph in a direct challenge to the authority of the Umayyad Caliph, and immediately went back on the offensive. In the winter of 740, his army met the Arab cavalry in a pitched battle at the Shalath Valley, utterly crushing them and killing 10,000 Umayyad soldiers. This was a massive victory for the Amazigh, as the flower of Arabic nobility in the western Maghreb had been utterly decimated, and the remaining Umayyad forces in the region were in complete panic. Finally, having heard of this uprising, Umayyad general Habib ibn Abi Ubaidah abandoned his Sicilian campaign in a hurry. He returned to the Maghreb, where he garrisoned Tlemcen and sent a plea for reinforcements. When word reached Caliph Hisham of the disaster in the west, he is said to have exclaimed the following about the rebels: "By God, I will most certainly rage against them with an Arab rage, and I will send against them an army whose beginning is where they are, and whose end is where I am." Phrygian Arab forces in Tlemcen, who had mustered some 40,000 men. Before long, an army of 70,000 was looking westward, ready to retake the land lost to the rebels. However, the joining of these two armies did not go swimmingly, and ancient pre-Islamic tribal rivalries permeated between them. Despite their internal enmity, the Umayyad army marched out in October of 741, meeting their foe at the town of Bagdura on the Sebu River. By now, the rebel Amazigh army had grown to a massive size, with some sources claiming that over 200,000 Berbers had joined the cause. It should also be noted that most of these were not professional soldiers, but laymen armed only with stones and knives, making the figure more plausible. The Ifriqiyan Arabs, having faced the Berbers in battle before, knew charge. However, anticipating the oncoming horsemen, the Berber forces skirted around the enemy steeds, using slings and spears to bring down their riders. The rebels then tied bags of water to the tails of wild mares, driving them mad, before sending them stampeding into the main line of Arab infantry, which prevented them from reinforcing their overextended cavalry. The Caliphate's cavalry was eventually encircled and massacred, while the infantry was overwhelmed by the sheer number of the Amazighs. Nearly 40,000 Umayyad troops were massacred at the Battle of Bagdura, making it one of the most disastrous defeats in the Caliphate's history. News of this victory at Bagdura encouraged more and more Berbers across the Umayyad realm to rebel. In Islamic Iberia, Amazigh soldiers stationed on the northern frontier abandoned their garrisons to wage war on their Arab masters in Toledo, Cordoba, and Algeciras. This revolt was eventually crushed, but it did allow King Alfonso I of Asturias to take advantage of the unrest and double the size of his domain, kick-starting one of the earliest stages of the Christian Reconquista. Meanwhile, the gains of the Amazigh back in North Africa were put to a halt when they failed to take the provincial capital of Kairouan in 742.